Hello YouTube, Kevin here for Superpower Broadcasting. In this video I'm going to be discussing what, in my view, very much appears to align with the narrative and the plot line of ultimately the early Star Wars series of the first trilogy. And it is interesting, it's politically relevant, and it's totally real. It's just, I find it fascinating. What we're going to be delving into in this video is a mesmerizing descent into darkness. And this is very, very weird. And it's something that I feel is important, and I feel that is not that well known, where even people that tend to care about these issues in general might not actually know the full story of what I'm going to be discussing. So I'm going to be talking about the ultimate transition of the current basically dictator of Hungary, Viktor Orban, from his early days and this is totally true. You can look into this. This has been reported on by the New York Times, for example. It's well reported and documented. He went from being the prodigy, one of the prodigies of George Soros, in accepting and taking a Soros Foundation scholarship to attend Oxford, and having a liberal internationalist view of affairs and a very more cosmopolitan perspective with respect to the world. He went from that to ultimately begin a descent into darkness, to the point now where he's turned Hungary into a fascist state and where he is the supreme leader. And I use the metaphor, the sort of the mirror, the aligned sort of plot of the early Star Wars films and the first trilogy to illustrate this downfall, because and this will contain some minor spoilers if you haven't seen I should say some major spoilers, but they seem to be more or less culturally ubiquitous to the point where you're probably aware of them if you have or you haven't seen the episode 1, 2, and 3 of Star Wars, but they will contain some spoilers for those movies. But if you do want to watch those movies, I would recommend them. I took a class on Star Wars in my last semester. They offered one at my university, and I'm generally into film. I got a film channel. If you guys ever want to watch my film reviews, I find film very important. I like film, and so I would recommend, and there's a new Star Wars film coming out this year, so if you want to catch up and everything, you should go through the initial trilogy. Well, by initial I mean in the numerical order. Of course, episode 4, 5, and 6 actually came out over a decade prior, but the thing is, in episodes 1, 2, and 3, they chronicle and show very clearly how Anakin Skywalker goes from being a young and optimistic Jedi and a force for good in the universe, in the galaxy, to ultimately plunging into what becomes, in essence, a lethal descent into darkness. And in his quest for greater power, aggrandizement of ego, ultimate sort of luxury, etc. But as well, in Vader's case, there's also the motivation out of love and familial interest that comes into it. But the thing is, in Orban's case, he sees this as the way to save his country or whatnot. He sees this as the way to preserve Hungary, to safeguard Hungary from the West. The thing is, Orban follows a very similar trajectory. A lot of people who are aware, generally, of international relations in the world, they know who Orban is. They don't like him. A lot of people that I'm talking about that happen to be liberal, they don't like Orban. But they might not know that Orban was given a scholarship by George Soros and was pretty much in line with George Soros' view on a lot of things. George Soros, of course, is very wealthy patron of education. He gives to the Soros Foundation, the Open Societies Foundation, which ultimately fights for things like rule of law, accountable government, to break down fascism. He got started in philanthropy by spending literally billions of dollars helping to erode and bring about the downfall of the Soviet Union. The man is a hero of liberal capitalism. He is an idol. He's larger than life. He is the kind of guy that, whether you like him or you dislike him, he is monolithic. And he is someone who has a lot of power in the world. And the thing is, he happens to be cosmopolitan. He happens to be liberal. He happens to be internationalist. He happens to believe in liberal values and believe those values to be universal, as I do. And the thing is, Viktor Orban, by all accounts, had embraced this fairly similar worldview. Now, Orban says that, well, he was misguided and being in the military changed his view on things and made him become an ultra-conservative fascist, etc. The thing is, though, what I'm going to be arguing here is that, in this video, Viktor Orban's trajectory largely is more or less just a psychological contrarian game where Viktor Orban, for whatever reason, got disillusioned with his mentor and his sponsor in George Soros and decided to go the exact opposite route despite him. And as a result, the Hungarian people now have to suffer a fascist dictatorship. And the thing is, there are similar stories throughout history. It's mainly like a pop culture thing, but there are a lot of people that think that if Adolf Hitler had been good enough, had been accepted into art school, that he might not have actually become the dictator that destroyed Europe. That sort of alternate history line exists out there. And a similar argument could be made with Viktor Orban, where if he hadn't become disillusioned with Soros, that he might have become this great progressive leader of Hungary. There are all kinds of different alternate history games that we can go. But, I mean, there is some value in ultimately seeing these things through the lens of and the trajectory of, you know, pop culture, things like Star Wars, because they're very familiar to people. People that don't really know too much about Hungarian politics, they might know Star Wars very well, and so a lot of this will make a lot of sense. The thing is, I'm part Hungarian, and the thing is, I can't ever see Hungary. I'll never travel there as long as this guy or his system is in place. I don't travel to fascist countries. I only travel within the West. And people that are smart, like Bill Browder, for example, he takes that policy now because he almost died in Russia, so he only travels to rule of law countries. I only travel to rule of law countries. And it sucks. I wish that all the world was a rule of law country, right? I wish we had a one big democracy. We never have to fight wars again, etc. But unfortunately, there's still dictatorships standing, and Viktor Orban's is one of them. And in his case, he transitions then from basically having this scholarship, everything, you know, sponsored by the Soros Foundation to go to Oxford. Just very, very prestigious and very, I would argue, very auspicious sort of place to be in. And he runs with that, and he decides to use it to subvert the democratic process, to undermine liberalism, to become an enemy of the West and Western values and liberal values. And ultimately, I would argue, the sole overarching aim, despite his initial mentor and patron, George Soros. It's disgusting. He is a very, very reprehensible man. He is a very, very, very childish, contrarian little punk, and he happens to have a country now. And he has the same emotional maturity of Kim Jong-un. Now, fortunately, he doesn't have nuclear weapons, but his daddy Putin does. Putin has a lot of nuclear weapons, over 7,000 by most estimates, more than the United States. So the United States are in better condition and much more easily deployable since the U.S. has a proper navy. Well, the Russian Navy is weaker than Italy's. And Italy's is nowhere even near the strongest in NATO. So the thing is, with Viktor Orban is the kind of man that, when it comes down to it, if you've seen those episodes of Star Wars from the early 2000s, episode 1, 2, 3, you see Anakin before he becomes Darth Vader. He goes from, this apprentice, this prodigy of Obi-Wan Kenobi. In this example, of course, Obi-Wan Kenobi represents George Soros, to becoming more and more whiny, to becoming more of a child. In other words, as he gets older, he gets more of an attitude of, well, why can't I have this? And, you're just trying to hold me back, and you're not the best master, Obi-Wan, and all of this childish, punky behavior, etc. And the thing is, he goes on, and, of course, in the Star Wars films, he ultimately joins the dark side because he has this debate within himself about, well, actually, is democracy the best way to organize a society, or is it better to have one ruler? And he gets disillusioned with the democratic process because the woman that he's trying to court is a senator, and he sees the political gridlock in the Capitol, and he thinks that it could all just be easier if there was a god emperor to use the whole Trump thing, to ultimately just get everything done. And he becomes co-opted by the Emperor Palpatine. And in this case, Viktor Orban, even though he's the supreme leader of Hungary now, he also got co-opted. Because these people that think like this, these people that have these emotional maturity stunts, these people where their ability to mature is stunted by this contrarian desire to spite their mentor or whatnot, their former patron. This aspect, this childishness, ultimately lends itself to co-optation. And Viktor Orban, even though he has all the power in Hungary, he himself serves a master, and his master is Vladimir Putin, just as Darth Vader serves Palpatine. Palpatine is Putin in this example. Putin co-opted and has used Viktor Orban as a proxy and a tool and a puppet against the West. And so Viktor Orban, in his quest for power and his quest for greed and his quest to spite Soros, has become a toady and a pawn of Vladimir Putin, who couldn't care less about him. Just as Putin doesn't actually care about Trump, he just uses them as assets. I can tell you, when Putin thinks that Trump is a greater liability than an asset to him, for example, if he decides that the U.S. will stay in Syria or the U.S. will take out the Iranian dictatorship, Putin will leak the dirt, and we will see that urine tape, and we'll see all the tax returns. We'll see everything, because the Russians hacked the RNC, the Russians hacked all that information, the Russians had cameras everywhere. If it happened, we'll know about it. Putin's just concealing it right now for the same reason that he leaked the information on the DNC, because it's politically advantageous to him. He doesn't actually have any loyalty to Trump, just as Trump doesn't have any loyalty to his workers. He fires them all the time without compensation. He stiffs people, etc. That's how this system is played. That's how fascism works. The loyalty only goes one direction. It only goes up. They'll throw you under the bus the second they think that you're not useful anymore. And sometimes even if you are kind of useful, they might still throw you under the bus for the same reason that Niccolo Machiavelli wrote in the 1600s. He said, well, what's a smart leader to do? Well, a smart leader, if they want to do bad things, they appoint somebody to do those bad things, and then after the mission is accomplished, they get the public around in the square, they get the guy who carried out the orders, they cut him in half and parade their body around for the people to celebrate and goad over, and then they appear as, the myth of the good Tsar. They look like the good ruler who he got rid of the bad guy, even though he was the one who employed the bad guy to do the bad thing in the first place. That's Machiavellianism. Putin operates in a very similar way. Putin is smart. As I argue on this channel, I don't like Putin. He's an enemy. He is an absolute enemy in a new Cold War. Well, basically the same Cold War, just with Russia as fascist instead of communist. But he's a bad guy. But I've never questioned his intelligence. He's a smart guy. And he saw Putin, or I should say he saw Orban, as emotionally immature and co-optable. And he co-opted him because that's what the Russian government does. They're good at it. They are great at co-opting. You can look at people like Tanky Tulsi Gabbard, people like Kremlin shill Jill Stein, people like Glenn Greenwald, people like Kyle Kulinski, people like Jimmy Dore, whom to various extents, Abby Martin, Lee Camp, Tom Hartman, the list goes on and on, even to some extent Larry King. And I've always liked Larry King. But to various extents in all these cases, they managed to co-opt these people, whether directly or indirectly, to get them to either be witting or unwitting assets of Russian fascism and conduct anti-American propaganda. Well, they did the same thing with Viktor Orban. And if you watch the Star Wars films, you know it doesn't actually end that well for Darth Vader. Well, it's not going to end that well for Viktor Orban either, because they're on the losing side of history. And as much as they call themselves the saviors of the West, I've got a video debunking the myth of Russia as the savior of the West. For example, for all the religious people out there, the Christians out there, if you think that Russia is so Christian and the West is so degenerate, 10 times as many Americans attend church each month or more regularly than Russians. Only 3% of Russians go to church once a month or more often, whereas 30% of Americans go to church once a month or more often. And that's according to Pew Research, which is a very legitimate polling outlet. And so I believe those numbers wholly. And so if you think that Russia is somehow more morally wholesome or whatever, no, it's just an atheist Putin playing to some religious dogma so that he can legitimize robbing the country and taking all their money and putting it in his own private bank account. That's what this is about. That's what organized religion has always been about. But the thing is, with this case of Viktor Orban's gone in this direction of just total darkness, and it won't end well for him. One of my remedies to dealing with him would be, well, NATO should just give him the boot. I understand that Erdogan is actually in many ways worse than Viktor Orban, but at least Turkey has the second largest military in NATO, and they're a big enough strategic asset that, like Saudi Arabia, even though they're bad guys, they're worth holding on to temporarily until we can deal with the other dictatorships. Because it's better to have some allies and then go to war with them later on than it is to just go to war with everybody at once to try to liberate them. That's not a strategically viable way of doing things. Even though the US and the West are the most powerful countries in the world, it's still better to have as much strength on your side as you can and choose your battles and go about things incrementally but progressively. The thing is, with Viktor Orban, he doesn't have the military assets. He doesn't have it. He is anathema to NATO on values, and he has no real value militarily. Turkey is anathema to NATO on values, but they are a great asset militarily. So Hungary should get the boot. Just say, no, we're not going to protect you. We're not going to provide all this legitimization. You're done. And, of course, now Viktor Orban, he sees Putin as his protector. He doesn't see NATO as his protector. He sees NATO as an evil, so he should leave anyway by his own volition. But the ultimate victims in this story, of course, are the Hungarian people. Because now the Hungarian people are robbed of democracy the same way the Russian people were robbed of democracy. It's tragic. And at the end of the day, I just don't see this ending well for Viktor Orban. Either he gets purged by an ambitious underling of his who has the same disrespect for him as he had for his former mentor, and he becomes a victim of the cycle of lust for greed and power, the same way that Kim Jong-un killed his uncle, etc. It goes on and on. That's how fascism works, the same way that Hitler killed the head of the SA to consolidate power. Or he goes about, Viktor Orban, and goes the Stalinist direction, and goes full fascist, and actually kills that underling, and kills a bunch of people beforehand to nip it in the bud. That's also a possibility. And then he maintains a full grip on the country. That's also another possibility. But either way, this does not end well for Hungary. Hungary's the victim in this. And it won't end that well for Orban. And in doing all this, Orban has just proven himself to just be this archetypal man-child who is stunted in his emotional maturity to the point of living the rest of his life now permanently with George Soros living rent-free in his head. And if anything, what this story should teach us is that even though Orban is a very bad guy, and even though the direction he's taking Hungary in is anathema to the West, there is some justice in this, in the sense that no matter how fascist Viktor Orban goes, no matter how egregious Viktor Orban becomes, he will always be tormented and always have to deal with George Soros and the compulsion to spite George Soros and the idea of George Soros guiding his every action as a reaction, because the guy is a child. And George Soros, even though George Soros is one of the richest people in the world, he's a tiny, tiny, tiny bit richer because he doesn't have to pay rent in Viktor Orban's head. Viktor Orban pays that rent and lets George Soros reside in his head 24/7. So thank you for watching, YouTube, and let me know what you think.